Close your eyes, let your shoulders drop, and take a soft, slow breath. You're about to drift back far back to a world long before hot showers, toothpaste, or fragrant soaps. Back to a time when people washed with water drawn from wells. When castles echoed with the crackling of firewood instead of running taps. And when the meaning of clean was different. This is the story of medieval hygiene, not just how people cleaned themselves, but how they thought about cleanliness, health, and the body. It's not all as unpleasant as you might expect. Some things may even surprise you with their gentle logic. Others may make you grateful for your cozy bed, warm bath, and toothbrush by your side. Let this book take you by the hand and gently lead you through muddy streets, perfumed chambers, herbal bathhouses, and the quiet, candlelit corners of medieval life. You won't need armor, just curiosity and a pillow beneath your head. Ready? The Middle Ages await. Baths in a time before plumbing. Imagine a world without bathtubs lined with porcelain or the twist of a hot water faucet. In medieval times, bathing was a process, a ritual even prepared with effort and purpose. A wooden tub would be carried out, sometimes placed near a hearth to warm the bather. Water had to be fetched by hand, heated in large kettles over open flames, and poured carefully into the tub until it was just warm enough. For those who lived in towns or near monasteries, there were public bathhouses, steam-filled, wooden-walled sanctuaries where people could soak, talk, or rest in silence. These were not just places to cleanse the body, but to restore the soul. Lavender might be added to the water. Music sometimes floated through the heavy air. Of course, not everyone bathed often. Many believed that too much washing could weaken the body or let disease in through the pores. Clean linen and brushing off dirt were often favored over full immersion. A good rub with a rough cloth, scented with rosewater if you could afford it, was common among the wealthy. And while the poor had less access to regular washing, they too knew the feeling of rinsing sore feet in cold streams, or wiping sweat with a piece of clean cloth after a day's work. It wasn't always glamorous, but it was part of life, a balance between practicality and tradition. So the next time you turn the tap and warm water runs, think of the quiet moments of those long ago, lowering themselves into steaming wooden tubs lit by candlelight. Tooth powder and breath of spice. There were no plastic toothbrushes, no tubes of minty paste, but people still cared for their teeth. In fact, medieval texts offer surprising advice on dental hygiene. Wealthy households might mix salt, crushed herbs, or even burn bread crusts into powders for brushing. These powders were often applied with cloth, rubbed gently across the teeth to remove food and freshen breath. The poor might chew on sticks or fibrous roots to clean their teeth. Licorice root, soft and sweet, was favored not just for its taste but for the way it rubbed against the enamel. Some even chewed parsley or cloves to improve the scent of their breath. Toothaches, however, were dreaded. There were no reliable dentists, only folk remedies, prayers, or in more desperate cases, extraction by a barber surgeon with iron tongs. But many people, even peasants, kept their teeth surprisingly well. A diet low in sugar and high in coarse bread, vegetables, and cheese helped reduce decay. And it was not uncommon for people to wash their mouths with wine or vinegar diluted with water, both acidic enough to help with bacteria, if used carefully. So while medieval mouths may not have sparkled like pearls, they were cared for in their own quiet way. Through crushed mint, ground charcoal, and the rinse of cold water, a kind of rhythm emerged, a different kind of clean clothes and the art of staying fresh. Cleanliness wasn't always about skin. In fact, in many parts of medieval Europe, a clean shirt was considered more important than a clean body. Linen was the secret weapon. It was worn next to the skin, beneath wool or leather garments, and changed regularly by those who could afford it. Linen absorbed sweat and body oils, and since it could be washed and bleached in the sun, it served as a kind of second skin. Laundry days were major affairs. Clothes were soaked in streams, scrubbed with ash soap, beaten against stones or wooden boards. In towns, washerwomen gathered along river banks, their laughter echoing as the fabric snapped in the wind. Perfume wasn't just for nobles. Simple scents made from lavender, rose petals, or herbs steeped in oils were used to mask odors. People carried scented pouches or wore garlands of herbs around their necks. Barbers didn't just cut hair. They trimmed beards, cleaned ears, picked fleas, and even gave a type of massage or grooming. Their shops were miniature hygiene centers, buzzing with conversation and the scrape of razors. Even in monasteries, where silence ruled, monks took special care to wash their hands before prayer and to keep their robes aired and clean. Cleanliness was next to godliness, and linen, lie, and discipline were part of spiritual hygiene. So while there may have smelled of hearth smoke and the roads were dusty, there was care beneath the layers, care stitched into linen seams, stirred in durable rinse bowls, and poured from copper kettles on washing day. Water, wells, and the ritual of washing. Water was precious. It wasn't just something that flowed easily from pipes or fountains. It had to be gathered bucket by bucket from wells, rivers, or springs. And the act of fetching water was often a morning ritual, done in silence or soft chatter as the sun rose and mist curled around rooftops. In cities, wells stood in courtyards or in public squares. The creak of the winch, the splash of the bucket, the cold of the rope in one's hands, it was all part of the daily rhythm. Children helped, neighbors nodded in greeting, and every drop brought home had value. People washed their hands and faces with cold water before meals. A bowl and a cloth by the door was a familiar sight. Especially in monasteries or noble halls, washing hands was a sign of respect, of discipline, of grace. Though full-body washing was rare for many, the small rituals of rinsing, dabbing, wiping with damp cloths, or even using snow in winter were practiced often, in warm weather. Some bathed in rivers, quiet places at dawn, where ripples danced and birds sang from reeds. To live in the medieval world was to live in closeness with water. You didn't waste it, you respected it. And even a single basin could offer a moment of peace, of renewal, of care. Hair, combs, and the fight against lice. Hair was not left to grow wild. It was brushed, oiled, braided, and sometimes shaved. For many, combing the hair was a daily practice, quiet and soothing. Like a small ceremony, wooden combs, carved with care, were passed down through families or sold at markets. A good comb had fine teeth thin enough to catch not only tangles, but lice. Lice were a part of life for many. No one was ashamed. Instead, they combed carefully, using vinegar rinses or herbs to soothe the scalp. Lavender, rosemary, and even garlic found their way into scalp remedies. Monks often shaved their heads in a ring called a tonsure. It was partly spiritual, but also practical. It made grooming easier and discouraged lice. Noble ladies braided their hair tightly, sometimes hiding it beneath linen caps or silk veils scented with herbs. Oils from nuts or animal fats were used to soften the hair. Ashes from certain woods, when mixed with water, acted as a kind of shampoo. Though the results were modest by today's standards, they were thoughtful and rooted in tradition. And when someone sat to have their hair combed, it was a moment of closeness. Mother and daughter, wife and husband, friends around a fire, gentle hands working through strands. The soft sound of wood teeth passing through hair, and a sigh of comfort in the stillness of evening. The privy, the chamber pot, and the backyard pit. Nature's call came, even in castles. But toilets, as we know them, did not exist. Instead, there were privies, small outhouses with wooden seats, tucked in gardens or built over streams. In castles, stone chutes called garderobes opened out to the moat or a pit below. Some were built into high towers, with wind whistling past as one did their business. They were cold, drafty, and not particularly private, but they worked. In homes, especially for the poor, chamber pots were common. These were emptied into dung pits, compost piles, or outside in the street, a practice that led to laws requiring people to call out before tossing waste from upper windows, despite the smell. There was care. Some used ashes or straw to cover waste. Sand, moss, or soft cloth served as toilet paper, and public latrines, especially in monasteries, were maintained with a sense of order, cleaned regularly and sometimes perfumed with herbs or smoke. The word hygiene didn't yet exist, but respect for the human body did. People did their best with what they had. They built systems, passed down habits, and taught children how to be clean in a world that was muddy and unpredictable. And in the quiet of a darkened chamber, with only a candle flickering beside a ceramic pot, Someone long ago might have felt what we all feel in such moments, the humble reminder of being human. The smell of the Middle Ages. It's easy to imagine the past as something dirty, as if the air itself were always heavy with filth. But the truth, like most things, is quieter and more layered. Yes. Streets could smell of waste after rain. Yes. Animals walked among people. And yes. Refuse sometimes lingered longer than it should. But people noticed. People cared. And they did more than you might think to live among the smells. Herbs were their shield. In kitchens, bundles of sage and thyme hung from beams, not just to flavor stew, but to scent the air. In bedrooms, lavender pillows were tucked beneath linen sheets. On feast days, rushes and herbs were scattered across stone floors not only to soften footsteps but to bring freshness underfoot. Those who could afford perfumes wore little pomanders, small metal balls filled with cloves, cinnamon, and resin. These were worn on chains or tucked into sleeves, in churches. Incense curled into the rafters, sweet and smoky, reminding the faithful of heaven. Clean shirts helped too. People believed that a fresh linen shirt could absorb bad odors and keep the body balanced. And so, even in places where soap was scarce and water precious, people reached for smells that comforted them, that masked what they could not change. So while you might picture the Middle Ages as a world of stink and grime, the truth is more like a tapestry woven with rosemary, wool, wood smoke, and wildflowers. And if you could close your eyes and breathe in deeply near a monastery garden or a noblewoman's chamber, you might find yourself surprised by sweetness, hospitals, clean hands, and holy healing, long before antiseptic wipes or sterile gloves. Care still existed. Healing was a sacred act. And cleanliness played a role even if people didn't yet understand germs. Monasteries often held the earliest hospitals. These weren't just places for the sick, but shelters for the poor, the weary, and the wounded. Monks and nuns tended to patients with a quiet discipline. Beds were simple. Sheets were changed often, washed in hot water and dried in the sun. Clean hands were emphasized not because of bacteria, but because healing was seen as holy. Dirty hands could offend the soul, so monks washed before touching the sick, sometimes even anointing hands with oil mixed with herbs. Wounds were cleaned with wine or vinegar. Compresses were made from crushed plants like comfrey or yarrow. Rooms were aired with open shutters, letting in breeze and light, and prayers rose alongside the scent of lavender water and beeswax. Candles. Even barbers, who handled bloodletting and tooth pulling, kept their tools in rolls of cloth. They sharpened blades carefully, wiped them between uses, and washed their aprons after long days. To be ill in medieval times was to rely on touch, scent, and ritual. Healing wasn't just about herbs, it was about being seen, bathed, and comforted. And while medicine lacked what we now know, it held its own form of care. So in the cool stillness of a stone infirmary, with white linen rustling and the hum of quiet voices, healing came slowly, gently, and always by human hands. The rules of the monks and the cleanliness of the soul. Inside the thick stone walls of monasteries, time moved differently. Bells rang out to mark each hour. Prayer followed labor. Silence was treasured. And cleanliness of body and soul was part of daily life. Monks lived by a rule. Not just a belief, but a written guide for every part of the day. The rule of Saint Benedict, followed by many, spoke not only of prayer and humility, but of washing. Monks were to wash their hands before meals, their feet after travel, and their faces each morning in cold, clear water. Clothing was simple but cared for. Robes were brushed, folded, and changed regularly. Linen undergarments were washed weekly. Hair was trimmed and careful. Circles. Baths were taken modestly and without vanity on schedule. In the lavatorium, a kind of communal washing area, large stone basins filled with fresh water. Hands were scrubbed before entering the refectory. Feet were sometimes washed as a sign of service and brotherhood, and even when soap was rough-handed. The water cold. The act of washing held meaning. It was a way to honor the body without worshipping it. A reminder that cleanliness, like prayer, could be a form of discipline. Dinner in a monastery was scented not with perfume, but with beeswax, parchment, and earth. The stone walls stayed cool. and the world outside noisy. Busy seemed to fade beneath the rhythm of bells and clean footsteps in bare halls. And as the monks lay down in their straw beds each night, after washing their hands and whispering the last prayers, a deep and silent peace settled over them, a peace born of order, of habit, of quiet care. The smell of the Middle Ages. It's easy to imagine the past as something dirty, as if the air itself were always heavy with filth. But the truth, like most things, is quieter and more layered. Yes. Streets could smell of waste after rain. Yes. Animals walked among people. And yes. Refuse sometimes lingered longer than it should. But people noticed. People cared. And they did more than you might think to live among the smells. Herbs were their shield. In kitchens, bundles of sage and thyme hung from beams. Not just to flavor stew, but to scent the air. In bedrooms, lavender pillows were tucked beneath linen sheets. On feast days, rushes and herbs were scattered across stone floors not only to soften footsteps but to bring freshness underfoot. Those who could afford perfumes wore little pomanders, small metal balls filled with cloves, cinnamon, and resin. These were worn on chains or tucked into sleeves. In churches, incense curled into the rafters, sweet and smoky, reminding the faithful of heaven. Clean shirts helped too. People believed that a fresh linen shirt could absorb bad odors and keep the body balanced. And so, even in places where soap was scarce and water precious, people reached for smells that comforted them, that masked what they could not change. So while you might picture the Middle Ages as a world of stink and grime, the truth is more like a tapestry woven with rosemary, wool, wood smoke, and wildflowers. And if you could close your eyes and breathe in deeply near a monastery garden or a noblewoman's chamber, you might find yourself surprised by sweetness, hospitals, clean hands, and holy healing. Long before antiseptic wipes or sterile gloves, care still existed. Healing was a sacred act, and cleanliness played a role even if people didn't yet understand germs. Monasteries often held the earliest hospitals. These weren't just places for the sick, but shelters for the poor, the weary, and the wounded. Monks and nuns tended to patients with a quiet discipline. Beds were simple, sheets were changed often, washed in hot water and dried in the sun. Clean hands were emphasized not because of bacteria, but because healing was seen as holy. Dirty hands could offend the soul, so monks washed before touching the sick, sometimes even anointing hands with oil mixed with herbs. Wounds were cleaned with wine or vinegar. Compresses were made from crushed plants like comfrey or yarrow. Rooms were aired with open shutters, letting in breeze and light. And prayers rose alongside the scent of lavender water and beeswax candles. Even barbers, who handled bloodletting and tooth pulling, kept their tools in rolls of cloth. They sharpened blades carefully, wiped them between uses, and washed their aprons after long days. To be ill in medieval times was to rely on touch, scent, and ritual. Healing wasn't just about herbs, it was about being seen, bathed, and comforted. And while medicine lacked what we now know, it held its own form of care. So in the cool stillness of a stone infirmary, with white linen rustling and the hum of quiet voices, healing came slowly, gently, and always by human hands. The rules of the monks and the cleanliness of the soul, inside the thick stone walls of monasteries, time moved differently. Bells rang out to mark each hour, prayer followed labor, silence was treasured, and cleanliness of body and soul was part of daily life. Monks lived by a rule, not just a belief, but a written guide for every part of the day. The rule of Saint Benedict, followed by many, spoke not only of prayer and humility, but of washing. Monks were to wash their hands before meals, their feet after travel, and their faces each morning in cold, clear water. Clothing was simple but cared for. Robes were brushed, folded, and changed regularly. Linen undergarments were washed weekly. Hair was trimmed in careful circles. Baths were taken modestly and without vanity on schedule. In the lavatorium, kind of communal washing area, large stone basins filled with fresh water. Hands were scrubbed before entering the refectory. Feet were sometimes washed as a sign of service and brotherhood, and even when soap was rough and the water cold. The act of washing held meaning. It was a way to honor the body without worshiping it. A reminder that cleanliness, like prayer, could be a form of discipline. There in a monastery was scented not with perfume, but with beeswax, parchment, and earth. The stone walls stayed cool, and the world outside noisy. Busy seemed to fade beneath the rhythm of bells and clean footsteps in bare halls. And as the monks lay down in their straw beds each night, after washing their hands and whispering the last prayers, a deep and silent peace settled over them, a peace born of order, of habit, of quiet care. The laundry day and the river's rhythm. Laundry was not a quiet task, but it had a rhythm, a kind of music all its own. The splash of water against cloth, the creak of wooden paddles, the swish of linen unfurling in the breeze. On certain days, especially in spring and summer, the banks of rivers and streams filled with women bent in half-light, sleeves rolled, laughter rising with the steam. To wash clothes was to work, and to watch, water had to be carried in buckets or drawn from deep wells. As soap, made at home from lion fat, was stirred into basins with cold or boiled water. White linen was soaked and scrubbed, pounded with smooth stones or wooden clubs. In some towns, communal washhouses existed, covered shelters with stone troughs and benches. Women shared stories while wringing out tunics and aprons. The soap might sting their fingers, but the conversation softened the day. Clothing was rinsed several times, hung on hedgerows or laid across fields to dry in the sun. It smelled of earth and grass, of wood smoke and water. A freshly laundered shirt was a source of pride, no matter how humble the garment. Even in winter, snow could be melted for washing, or clothes were simply beaten to remove dust and aired for freshness. No one expected perfection, but they expected care. And when the sun sank low and the last shirt was folded into a basket, there was peace in it, the quiet knowledge that something had been cleansed, made new again, touched by water and wind and human hands. Linen layers, and the hygiene of dress. In the Middle Ages, clothing did more than warm the body. It protected the skin, absorbed sweat, and helped keep the outer layers clean. And so, hygiene lived not just in washing but in how people dressed. The layer closest to the body was nearly always linen, soft, breathable, and light in color. Linen undergarments were prized for their ability to stay dry and fresh. These shirts and shifts were washed often even if the woolen garments above them were not. Men wore long tunics or short-sleeved chemises under surcoats and cloaks. Women wore shifts beneath gowns, sometimes changing them every few days. Wealthier households had more sets, with some people changing linen daily. For peasants, one or two might last the week, but even they tried to keep it clean. Wool, while harder to wash, was brushed, aired, and beaten free of dust. Cloaks were hung by open windows. Boots were scraped clean of mud. Hats and hoods were wiped down with damp cloths. Linen collars, cuffs, and coifs could be removed and washed separately, keeping the appearance neat. Lace and embroidery were reserved for special garments, and often gently hand-washed in warm water with soapwort. Even armor had its rituals padded. Gambesons worn beneath were washed and aired, while the metal plates were polished with vinegar and oil to resist rust. Nights depended on cleanliness just as much as comfort. To dress each morning was an act of quiet intention, a moment to layer protection, identity, and dignity over the body. And when someone walked past with a clean collar, a fresh tunic, or a well-kept hem, others noticed not with envy, but with respect. Cleanliness, after all, wasn't about vanity. It was about showing care for yourself, and for those around you. Nighttime routines and the washing before sleep. When the stars began to rise over the hills and the hearth crackled low, the world slowed. In cottages and keeps alike, people prepared for rest not just by closing shutters or banking the fire, but by turning to the quiet rituals of evening hygiene. A basin of water sat near the door or the bed. Cold, clear, often still with leaves floating inside, it waited for the final wash. People dipped their hands, cupped water to rinse their faces, wiped their necks with linen cloths. The chill was bracing, but it signaled the end of labor, the beginning of peace. Feet were cleaned, especially in summer. Dust and mud from the road were scrubbed off with cloth or straw. Children were helped by their mothers, who gently rubbed their heels and dried between their toes with practiced hands. In noble homes, Warm water might be brought in a copper jug. Servants would fill ceramic basins, scent the water with lavender or chamomile, and leave soft towels by the bed. But even in the humblest homes, a splash of water before sleep was a treasured comfort. Hair was combed out by firelight. Braids were loosened, caps tied in place. Fingernails were checked, shirts removed, and wool blankets shaken to free them from hair or crumbs. The body, no matter how tired, was gently made ready for rest. And then came the stillness. The moment after the last candle was snuffed, when skin was cool from washing, sheets rustled, and the air smelled faintly of soap, ash, and earth. It was then that sleep came, not just as escape, but as reward, a gift earned through honest work, quiet care, and the small, tender rituals that reminded even the poorest soul, you are worth the comfort of being clean. The healing garden, and the hands that gathered. Behind the walls of monasteries and within the courtyards of manor houses, there grew gardens not just of beauty, but of medicine. These were healing gardens, green, humming places where hygiene began with the leaf, the root, the flower. There, bent over rows of sage and calendula, were the gatherers. Often they were monks, or nuns, or older women from the village who had learned the ways of the earth by watching their mothers and grandmothers. They knew when to pick each plant not by date, but by the softness of the stem, the scent in the air, the feel of the season in their hands. Chamomile for calming, mint for freshening the breath, rosemary for rubbing into sore muscles and steeping in foot baths, comfrey for wounds, marigold for the skin. Every herb had a purpose, and those who gathered them washed their hands first. Always, as though the act of healing began not in the garden, but in the gesture, in the shade. They dried leaves on woven mats. Flowers were strung upside down to keep their color. Roots were scrubbed and chopped, then boiled down in thick pots to make salves and ointments. These potions were used to clean wounds, scent linens, wash hair, or steep into teas for fever and restlessness. Some were simple, others were complex recipes, passed down in silence, guarded like treasure. And the garden itself was clean, not manicured, not perfect but purposeful. Pots were swept, water was fetched, beds were weeded. It was a living pharmacy built on time, care, and the understanding that healing begins long before a fever takes hold. So when someone stepped into that garden, even in the darkest times, they stepped into hope, into the scent of thyme and beeswax, into the work of hands that gathered and never stopped believing in gentle restoration. The barbers, the razors, and the ritual of the blade. Barbers in the Middle Ages were more than hair cutters. They were surgeons, tooth pullers, bleeders of bad humors. But beyond their strange and varied tasks, they were also keepers of an ancient ritual, the razor and the wash. Their shops were small and often filled with light from a single window. There was always a chair, a basin, and the sharp gleam of steel. Hanging on the walls were strops, towels, bottles of oil, and sometimes herbs, dried bay or lavender to calm the air. Before each shave, a cloth was dipped in hot water and pressed to the client's face. The steam opened pores, softened the beard, and made conversation unnecessary. The barber would wipe the skin gently, speak only if spoken to, and run his thumb along the blade with reverence. The razor was stropped again and again, until it gleamed like a crescent moon. Soap was whipped into a lather, thick and fragrant, and painted on with a soft bristled brush. Then came the shave, slow, deliberate, like a dance. The sound was almost nothing, a whisper of steel on skin, the faint crackle of hair. The barber cleaned the blade between strokes, wiped away the lather, then splashed the skin with cool water infused with rose or vinegar. It was intimate, but never rushed. To be shaved in this way was to be treated as someone worthy of precision, care, and stillness, and for many men, it was the only time they were touched with such quiet purpose. The barber's towel was always clean, his blade was always honed, his shop smelled of smoke, oil, and soap. And when a man stepped out, cheeks smooth, had light, something in him had shifted. He was not just groomed, he was renewed. The privy, the nightjar, and the truth of quiet needs. Not every part of hygiene was graceful. Some things were practical, necessary, quiet, and yet, even here behind wooden doors, in shadows, or at night, there was dignity. The privy was often a small, detached building, sometimes stone, sometimes timber, with a simple seat above a pit. In castles, it might be a chute built into the outer wall. In townhouses, a bench behind the courtyard. In villages, a spot near the edge of the field, marked by familiarity. Lime was scattered into the pit to control smell. Ashes, too. Doors were kept closed. A small jug of water or cloth might be left nearby. And though it was not spoken of in polite company, everyone knew this too was part of life. At night, especially in winter, few wanted to walk outside. So the night jar came out, a ceramic or wooden pot, kept under the bed. It was used quietly, respectfully, and emptied each morning by someone in the household. For noble women, servants carried scented sachets and perfumed cloths. In monasteries, communal privies were kept scrubbed and built with channels of running water when possible. It was not perfect, but it was effort. People washed after, not always with soap, but with water or cloth. And there were rules instated, but followed. Wash your hands. Don't speak of smells. Mind your turn. Keep the cloths dry. Even in discomfort, people sought order. A kind of invisible cleanliness, not just of body, but of routine. And so, as the stars turned overhead and houses quieted, the last rituals of the day were done in the dim glow of embers. And even this most human of acts was touched by care, because in the Middle Ages, as now, cleanliness wasn't always about what could be seen. It was often about what was done quietly, faithfully, and without applause. The market smells and the subtle art of staying fresh. The market was not quiet. It buzzed and clattered, full of voices and hooves and haggling. But beneath the loudness lived a different story, a story of small efforts to stay fresh in a world that rarely paused. Women passed with baskets of herbs slung over their arms: parsley, thyme, fennel. Not only for soup, but for scent. A tucked sprig of mint behind the ear, a handful of dried lavender in a cloth pouch beneath the bodice. These were the perfumes of ordinary people. Vendors stood all day, sun on their backs. The fishmonger wiped his hands constantly with briny rags, his apron soaked with salt water. The baker brushed flour from his sleeves and kept a damp cloth to wipe the sweat from his brow. Some chewed cloves or aniseed to freshen their breath. Others boiled rosemary or marjoram and dabbed the water behind their ears. A bit of vinegar on a cloth might be wiped across the neck or hands. In summer, water infused with lemon peel was prized in cities where the heat lingered in stone alleys. Clothing helped to layers of linen close to the skin absorbed what needed to be hidden. These undergarments were changed when possible, rinsed in a stream or scrubbed at the edge of town. And then there were the subtle touches: a comb run through hair before walking into town, a clean ribbon tied at the wrist, hands washed in rainwater caught in a basin. Freshness, in those days, was not about absence of odor. It was about intention, about not offending others, about dignity, and about presenting oneself as someone who still noticed the body even when life was difficult. So the market, for all its noise and clamor, was also a place of care, of effort, of quiet ways. People tried, every day, to remain softer on the edges in a world of smoke and sweat. Childhood cleanliness and the songs that came with it. In the quiet corners of villages and manors alike, cleanliness began early, with children swaddled not only in cloth, but in love and ritual. A mother's hands guided, a father's voice calmed. And washing became something more than habit, it became song. Infants were bathed in shallow wooden tubs, the water warmed by the hearth. A soft linen cloth wiped over their skin, and herbal oils pressed from calendula or chamomile were gently rubbed into the scalp. Their tiny hands were cleaned with kisses between each finger. Older children knew the rhythms of daily care: hands washed after chores, feet rinsed before bed, hair combed in long strokes while the fire popped. Girls helped their mothers, boys copied their fathers, and when they protested, songs filled the air. Wash the toes and count the stars, scrub the elbows, skip the scars. Dip and rinse and hum a tune, be fresh and clean by silver moon. Children played in mud, climbed trees, and ran through markets. But by twilight, their bodies were returned to order. They sat quietly while warm cloths wiped away the day. The scent of soaproot and sun lingered on their skin. When illness came, and it often did, cleanliness became sacred. Sheets were boiled, hands were scrubbed, cups were kept separate. Mothers whispered prayers while they cleaned little foreheads with vinegar water and sang lullabies low and slow. Even the poorest families, with little more than rainwater and rags, kept these rituals alive, because cleanliness, in childhood, was never just about hygiene. It was about love, about holding small bodies with reverence, about passing down not only habits, but tenderness. And so the songs endured. The cloths were rinsed, and childhood, in all its dirt and wildness, was gently returned to stillness before every sleep. The church, the soul, and the sacredness of clean hands. To step into a church in medieval times was to step into stillness. Cold stone beneath your feet, filtered light through colored glass, the faint scent of incense and beeswax rising in the air. And before anything else, before prayer, before the sign of the cross, there was the washing of hands. Near the door, a small basin, often carved from stone, held holy water, fingers dipped, foreheads touched, a quiet gesture of cleansing, not of dirt, but of spirit. The body prepared the soul. Monks and nuns, whose lives were marked by routine and reverence, washed their hands before every meal, every service, every act of labor. A pitcher would pour clear water over waiting hands while psalms were whispered. The towel, simple and worn, was folded with care. Pilgrims, dusty from weeks on the road, would kneel outside before entering a shrine. They would rinse their feet in a shared bowl, scrape mud from their cloaks, and comb their hair with borrowed fingers. To present oneself clean before God was not vanity, it was humility. Even the act of confession began with small ablutions. A priest might wash his hands in silence. Before listening, his fingers would smell faintly of frankincense and soap. On feast days, entire communities washed more thoroughly. Garments were brushed, faces were scrubbed, children's hair was tied with ribbons, bells rang, and people arrived not perfect, but prepared. In the church, candles flickered like stars in stone sky. The echo of chant floated through arches, and among the incense, the prayers, and the ancient wooden pews, there lingered always the quiet truth. To cleanse the hands was to ready the heart. To wash before God was to say, I have tried to be whole. And that even in the Middle Ages was a kind of beauty beyond words. The village bathhouse and the steam that spoke of rest. In many villages, there was one place where warmth waited on cold days and stillness wrapped itself around weary limbs, the bathhouse. Though simple in form, often little more than wood and stone, it stood like a secret sanctuary for bodies aching from toil and chill. The bathhouse was often heated by a great fire beneath or beside a large tub. Water was carried in buckets, heated slowly, mixed with cooler jugs, until the temperature was just right. The steam rose in ribbons, curling into corners, softening the walls and the silence. Men and women usually bathed separately, on different days or in separate spaces. In towns, there might be several rooms, warm chambers lined with benches, steam rooms filled with herbs like thyme or eucalyptus, and cold pools for those who wished to finish their visit with a shiver and clarity. Villagers scrubbed with rough cloths or bundles of dried twigs. Ash soap, often homemade, was rubbed into the skin with slow, circular motions. Water was poured from above, not in haste, but as if returning the body to its place of rest. People washed each other too. Wives scrubbed husbands' backs. Friends helped untangle hair. Even strangers offered soap with a nod. The bathhouse was not just a place for cleaning, it was a place for gentleness. For sitting in warmth when the world was cold. For pausing without needing to speak. After the bath, bodies were wrapped in linen or wool. Tea was sometimes offered, hot water steeped with mint or chamomile. There were stories, laughter, yawns. And then, one by one, people drifted back into the dark streets, cleaner, lighter, softer than when they came. The bathhouse did not promise perfection, but it gave something far rarer, a moment when warmth touched the skin and silence settled in the bones. The traveler's wash and the rites of the road. Not all had homes. Some had paths long, winding, and certain roads stretching through forest and field, from market to monastery, from one village to the next. Travelers in the Middle Ages were merchants, messengers, pilgrims, seekers. And even on the road, they sought cleanliness, though it was humble and improvised. At rivers and streams, they would stop enrolling a linen cloth, laying down their satchel. They would strip to the waist and wash with cupped hands, teeth chattering in the spring melt or sighing in the summer heat. Water was sacred, no matter how small the pool. And the act of bathing in the wild was done with quiet gratitude. Boots were removed, soles dried, tunics beaten clean of dust. A wooden comb would pull through knots while birds chirped nearby. Some travelers carried a bundle of herbs, lavender to rub into tired feet, bay leaf for joints, or rosemary for the scalp. A vial of vinegar water might be used to wipe the forehead. A scrap of soap was guarded carefully, wrapped in cloth like a treasure. At inns, if coin allowed, a small bath could be requested. A tub filled while the guest waited, sitting by the hearth. Towels warmed by the fire. A drink offered, mead or cider, as the body slowly returned to stillness. Yet many nights were spent outdoors under trees or beneath eaves. And even then, care was taken, a rinse from a water skin, or rubbed down with a dry cloth, a clean shift pulled over a weary chest. The road did not forgive easily. But those who walked it knew, to wash was to remember that one was more than a traveler. One was still whole, still worthy of care. And so, among stones and stars, cleanliness walked quietly beside the dusty feet of the wandering. The midwife's hands and the ritual of birth. When a child was ready to arrive, the village turned toward its midwife, the one who had seen birth take root in silence, who had guided life from darkness into morning. Her hands were known, trusted, and always clean. She came with a cloth bundle, tied with cord, towels, boiled linen, herbs, ointments, and a small pot of soap. Before touching the mother, she washed her hands with water warmed by the hearth, even if the hour was late or the room cold. The washing was never skipped. It was sacred. The space was made ready not with candles and prayers alone, but with order. Straw was laid. Sheets were hung for warmth. Water was kept simmering. All was quiet but the breath of the woman laboring, and the soft murmur of the midwife's voice. During birth, cloths were changed again and again. Warm water was poured gently to ease pain, to clean, to bless. Herbs were crushed and wrapped in cloth for the mother to smell sweet balm, rose, a little mint. The child was caught in linen, eyes blinking at dim light. The umbilical cord was cut with a clean blade and tied with washed thread. The midwife wiped the newborn carefully, not to remove all, but to welcome gently. Then came the bath, a shallow basin, warm water scented faintly with flowers. The midwife washed the baby's head with steady fingers, rinsed tiny limbs, and wrapped the infant in fresh cloth. The mother, too, was tended. Her face wiped. Her hair smoothed. Her hands held until sleep arrived. For in that moment, hygiene was not only for health. It was for love. For reverence. For honoring the miracle of arrival. And so, long before medicine had names for what the midwife knew, she kept the oldest truth, that to welcome life cleanly was to welcome it kindly. And that every hand must first be washed with care before holding the weight of a soul. The laundress by the river and the rhythm of soap and stone. At the edge of nearly every village, where willows bent toward the water and birds dipped their beaks to drink, worked the laundresses. They were women with strong arms, rolled sleeves, and voices that carried over the stream like birdsong. Before sunrise, they came with baskets of linen, wooden paddles, bars of ash soap wrapped in cloth. The river was not merely a place for cleaning, it was a place of rhythm, of routine, of soft, shared silence. Clothes were soaked and scrubbed against worn stones, or pounded gently with the wooden beetle. Soap made from tallow and lye was rubbed in slow circles into the fabric. Stains were treated with vinegar, or sometimes just elbow and patience. The river did not hurry, and neither did the women. As they worked, they told stories of births, of bad harvests, of dreams. Laughter wove through the steam that rose when hot water was poured from kettles. When the weather turned cold, their breath joined the mist in great cloudy puffs. Between rinses, cloths were laid on bushes to dry or hung over wooden poles. Whites caught the sun. Colors fluttered like faded flags. And still the water ran, and still the paddles struck, and still the river listened. Children helped too, fetching water or wringing out smaller garments. Girls watched their mothers, learned the rhythm, learned the patience. It was not a glamorous task, but it was important. Clean clothes brought dignity. They meant readiness for market, for mass, for marriage. They meant comfort during sleep and pride in appearance. And the laundress, though often unnoticed, was the keeper of that dignity. So when the baskets were finally lifted and the last cloth wrung dry, the women walked home slowly, their arms tired but their hearts steady. The day was done. The river had spoken. And the world was just a little cleaner. The noble's chamber and the perfume of power. Far from the village stream and the stone towers of lords and ladies, another form of cleanliness held sway, a quieter, more perfumed, more adorned with silks than soap. Yet even among velvet and wealth, hygiene still whispered its ancient songs. Noble chambers were dark and cool, lit by candles and warmed by tapestries. Servants moved through the rooms with purpose, carrying basins of warm rosewater, bringing cloths scented with thyme, placing fresh sprigs of rosemary in the corners to mask the smell of closed air. Baths, for those of means, were elaborate events. A wooden tub lined with cloth, filled by servants with buckets warmed by fire. Petals might float upon the water of lavender, marigold, even crushed strawberries in the summer months. The noblewoman sat in the water as her hair was brushed with ivory combs. The nobleman leaned back while his neck was wiped with soft linen. Not every day, no, baths were rare, precious, nearly ceremonial. But when they came, they were wrapped in silence and candlelight. Between such occasions, the body was maintained in other ways. Daily, faces and hands were washed. Perfumed oils were dabbed at the wrists, temples, and behind the ears. Linen underclothes were changed more often than outer garments, and feet were massaged with mint or sweet balm. To smell pleasant, in court or castle, was to show control. It was to mask the wildness of the world outside, the mud, the animals, the fires. Barbers, too, tended daily. They not only shaved and trimmed but cleaned ears, pulled teeth, lanced boils, all in the name of refinement. Their tools were precise, their hands skilled, their cloths clean. Hygiene, in the noble class, was not only about health. It was about image. It was about being above the earth even while living upon it. And when a noble stepped from their chamber freshly powdered and scented with orange blossom or clove, the world saw not just status, but someone who had learned the art of quiet elegance in a time of rough living. The monastery washroom and the water of the spirit. Within high stone walls, beneath the bells and chanting, monks moved through a world ruled by silence and sacred routine. Each action had its hour. Each hour, its task. And among these tasks, hygiene held its place, quiet, humble, but deeply respected. The monastery had a lavatorium, a long washroom where basins stood beneath stone spouts. Water flowed gently from small carved mouths, lions, sheep, or angels, depending on the order. It was cold, clear, and ever-moving, like the life of the monks themselves. Before meals, before prayers, before copying manuscripts, monks would pause. They lined up calmly, washed their hands without haste, dried them with cloths kept folded in wooden chests. No talking. Just the sound of water, footsteps on stone, the creak of robes. In the early mornings, faces were washed with water drawn from the well. Beards trimmed with bone-handled shears. Nails cleaned with little knives. Feet tended when sore from garden work or pilgrimage walks. Clothes were plain but kept orderly. Sandals were wiped free of dust. Linen habits were washed in the monastery yard, hung behind stone walls where sun and wind did their part. Infirmaries, tended by monk physicians, were kept scrupulously clean. Beds were aired, wounds bathed, hands always washed before touching the sick. Salves were made from herbs grown in the cloister garden, sage, wormwood, comfrey, and applied with reverent care. The monks believed that to cleanse the body was to make space for the soul. to remove the distractions of discomfort, to honor the vessel given by God. And so, within walls that held no vanity, hygiene was not a chore. It was prayer made physical. And water cold, honest, and pure was the first blessing of every day. The pilgrimage path and the washing of the soul. A pilgrimage was more than a journey. It was a surrender of comfort, of certainty, of the everyday. Pilgrims walked miles, sometimes for weeks or months, following sacred routes toward holy sites. Santiago.Canterbury.Rome. And with each step, the body gathered dust while the spirit sought cleansing. Yet even on the open road, hygiene found its place. At way stations, hostels, and monasteries along the path, weary travelers would rest and wash. Not always fully, and not always in comfort. But feet, blistered from miles of stone and mud, were soaked in warm water. Dust was scrubbed from faces and hands. Dirty tunics were rinsed in basins beside the fire, laid to dry over branches or simple ropes. Some shrines had sacred springs or wells, said to hold healing powers. Pilgrims would approach quietly, cupping water in their palms to cleanse their faces, anoint their heads, or sip in silence. The water was believed to purify more than skin. It softened the burdens of the soul. Pilgrims often carried small bundles, a sliver of soap, a comb, or rag of linen. Not much, but enough to offer care to their bodies as they walked towards something greater than themselves. At night, the act of cleaning became part of their evening ritual. Wiping the sweat from their brow, rinsing sore feet, whispering a prayer while dabbing vinegar on a wound. They might sleep in haylofts or beneath the stars. But even in those rough places, the ritual remained. To wash on the road was not just for health, it was a declaration: I still belong to the world. I still carry the dignity of being human. And so, even in silence, even in solitude, the pilgrim walked with a kind of grace, one foot before the other, one washcloth against the skin, carrying not only dust, but hope. The candlemaker's wife and the scent of clean tallow. In the heart of a busy medieval town, tucked between the apothecary and the butcher's stall, lived a woman known only as the candlemaker's wife. Her fingers were forever marked by wax and work, and her home smelled of beeswax, ash, and something sweet, perhaps lavender, stored in drawers. Their cottage was small, the windows streaked, the floors often dusty from soot and wood chips. But within those walls, the woman kept a tidy, glowing world, where cleanliness meant more than mere polish. Each morning, she wiped the wooden counters with vinegar water, brewed from the dregs of sour cider. She swept the hearth with care, then beat the rugs in the back alley. Ashes were saved in a pail, not thrown away, but used to make soap. Yes, soap. She boiled rainwater with lye she leached from the ashes, stirring until the mixture turned thick and pale. Into this, she added tallow of the clean fat from animals rendered carefully and filtered through cloth. The result was rough, beige soap that smelled faintly of earth, but cleaned well and lasted long. She used it to scrub pots, to wash hands, to launder the shirts of her husband after long hours over fire. On washing days, she filled the copper tub and gently scrubbed her arms, her neck, her legs, humming a tune as steam rose around her. A little rose water behind the ears. A comb pulled slowly through her hair. Clean didn't mean luxurious. It meant made with care. It meant taking what little the world gave and making it enough. The candlemaker's wife wrapped soap in cloth and sold it alongside her husband as tapers. People came not just for light, but for the small bar of something pure. And in the quiet of her tidy home, where wax cooled on wooden boards and clean linens fluttered near the fire, she lived a life of soft simplicity, where each small act of washing was not a burden, but a light. The winter bath and the hearthside stillness. When snow lay heavy on the thatched roofs, and the wind sang through every crack in the timber, the thought of bathing in cold water made even the bravest shudder. And yet, winter did not stop the need for cleanliness, only changed how it was done. In the cold months, water was precious and slow. Buckets had to be broken of ice, carried with stiff fingers, warmed with patience. The bath, a wooden tub, often round and deep, was brought near the hearth, where firelight danced along the walls. Baths in winter were rare, sometimes only once or twice a season. But when they happened, they became something close to sacred. Clothes were peeled off in the fire's glow. Warm cloths wrapped around shoulders. Steam from the boiling pot misted the windows. And the first splash of hot water brought sighs of relief and gratitude. Children were bathed first, quick, laughing, splashing under the careful eye of their mother. Then the parents, one after the other, soaking sore joints, eyes closing with every ladle poured. Herbs were added to the water, pine needles, dried mint, a pinch of salt. The scent filled the room, mixing with wood smoke and bread rising in the nearby oven. Afterward, towels, coarse but clean, were pressed into skin. Feet rubbed dry and placed in warm socks. A drop of oil on the scalp. A clean tunic pulled over tired arms. And then, rest. Bodies curled on benches near the fire. A cup of broth passed from hand to hand. Steam fading into quiet. In those frozen months, to wash was not only about the body. It was about warmth. About coming in from the dark. About reminding oneself that even in coldest times, the home was a haven, and the water, though hard won, was healing. And as night fell outside, and snow crept across the windows, there in the flicker of the fire, a clean body rested, a warm heart slowed, and sleep came. As gentle as falling snow. The shepherd's river and the washing beneath the sky. High in the green hills, where fences were nothing but stone piles, and the wind carried the scent of heather and sheep, lived the shepherds. They were men of few words and deep weather lines across their faces. Days began with the sky and ended with stars. In between, there were hooves, wool, barking dogs, and silence. But even there, among moss and solitude, hygiene had its quiet place. The shepherd knew the rhythm of water. Every stream, every hollow in the rock that held clear rain, every cold trickle that ran down the hill, these were his wash basins, his mirrors, his lifelines. At dawn, he would kneel by the river's edge. Hands, cracked from rope and cold, cupped water and brought it to his face. No soap. Just water of the mountain kind, pure and clean as breath. He would rinse the sleep away, blink toward the sun, and begin. There were no towels, only the breeze and the warmth of movement. Shirts, when they grew stiff from sweat or mud, were rinsed in the current and hung from branches. A rough shirt cleaned by river and wind smelled not of perfume but of life. The shepherd's hair was combed with his fingers. His teeth rubbed with a cloth soaked in salt or mint leaves. His hands washed again and again after birthings, after blood, after rain. Hygiene in the highlands was not a routine, but an instinct. To wash was to return to the rhythm of the world, water to skin, wind to cheek, earth to foot. And there, under a sky untouched by chimney smoke, the shepherd walked clean in a world that never noticed, and never needed to. He needed no mirror to know when he felt well. They went into at a time smallest first. Soap was made from herbs and ash, and though it stung the eyes, it smelled of rosemary and something like home. Sister Merrill would scrub gently. Behind ears, under nails, between fingers. Not quickly, but carefully. As if each child was only one. Then came the rinsing, the drying with coarse but warm cloths, the combing of hair. Afterward, they were wrapped in their cleanest shifts. Sometimes they were given bread. Sometimes a sweet root. Always, a kiss to the forehead. They would sleep deeper that night. Their skin warm, their hair soft, their spirits lightened not just by water, but by being seen, touched gently, remembered. In a world where they had little, a bath was everything. And as the fire crackled low, and the basin steamed empty in the moonlight, Sister Merrill folded each damp cloth with care. Because to wash a child was to believe they mattered. And that belief could carry them through anything. The monastic silence and the ritual of cold water. Behind walls of ivy-covered stone, where bells echoed not for men but for God, the monks lived in silence, in stillness, in sacred rhythm. And among all their vows, poverty, chastity, obedience, there was another, and spoken yet enduring, the vow of cleansing. Each morning, Before dawn pulled its pale light across the cloisters, the monks gathered at a carved stone basin nestled in the center of their courtyard. Spring water trickled into it year-round, even in the frost of midwinter. A quiet, constant stream, like the breath of the world itself. One by one, barefoot and wordless, the brothers stepped forward. They dipped their hands into the icy water, pressing it to their foreheads, their wrists, the back of their necks. It was not for vanity, not even for comfort, but to greet the day with presence, to wash away the heaviness of sleep, the remnants of thought, the subtle stains of ego. The cold bit their skin, but woke something deep within: clarity, humility, gentleness. Some monks would rub a few drops of lavender oil into their palms afterward, or mint from the garden, just enough to carry a quiet fragrance into the work of the day, whether tending vines, copying psalms, or standing long hours in prayer. They spoke little, but their hands were clean, and their silence was radiant, for the water had touched more than flesh. It had brushed the edge of soul, the pilgrim's feet, and the dust of holy roads. He walked. He walked through cities and farmlands, by rivers and through woods, across bridges carved long ago by forgotten hands. He was a pilgrim not for penance or pen, but for purpose. On his back a pack. In his hand a wooden staff. On his feet cracked leather shoes, torn by time and stone. But most of all, he carried dust. Dust of chapel floors. Dust of roadside prayers. Dust of blessings whispered in languages he could not name. And when he reached a monastery, an inn, or even a humble cottage, his first request was not for bread or a bed, but for water. He would kneel beside a basin, or sometimes a wooden bowl, and slowly, reverently, wash his feet. The water turned gray with the day's journey, but it was never wasted. He washed the spaces between his toes, the sore curves of his heels, the arches that carried miles of hope. And then he'd dry them by the fire, pressing warmth into the tired bones. Sometimes, if fortune allowed, he'd rub in a balm of juniper or pine resin. And when he lay down to rest, wrapped in wool or straw, he would sleep not just as a traveler, but as a man whose feet had touched holy ground. Clean feet, quiet dreams, and a path waiting for morning. The village elder and the last well of summer. In a village where rooftops were softened with moss, and the smoke from chimneys drifted like old lullabies into the sky, lived the elder. Everyone knew him. Children knew him for his stories. Farmers knew him for his wisdom. And the old ones, they knew him as the one who stayed. Each morning, he walked slowly, leaning on a cane to the village well. Not to draw water himself. His hands had grown weak, his back bent from years. But he sat beside it on a small stool carved from oak, watching, listening, waiting. When someone filled a bucket, a boy, a mother, a passerby, he would ask for just one bowl. Not to drink, but to wash. He would dip his long fingers into the bowl, one by one, rinse his palms, pat his weathered face. The skin was thin now, like parchment, creased and delicate. But the water didn't judge. As it ran over his knuckles, he remembered bathing his children when they were small, being washed by his wife on fevered nights, and long before that, his own mother washing his face by candlelight. Water connected the chapters of his life. And here, in the soft edge of age, it reminded him that life had not been only toil. There had been gentleness. There had been care. Afterward, he would rub thyme and beeswax into his hands, warming the balm with his breath. He would sit, not speaking, letting the sun fall gently over his shoulders. And sometimes, if the wind was just right, he would hum a song that no one else remembered. A song about wells and days, and the way water knows all things, even how to soothe a man made of memory. The midwife's hands and the sacred cloth. In a quiet cottage near the edge of a forest, where there always smelled of thyme and milk, there lived a midwife. She had helped birth more children than she could count. She had been there at beginnings and sometimes at quiet endings. Her hands were strong, not because they had lifted heavy loads, but because they had held life itself. Before each birth, she followed a ritual passed down through generations. She would warm water over the hearth, slow and steady. Into the basin, she would place a clean linen cloth, one she had woven herself, months before, just for this moment. The cloth was soft, soaked with heat, and smelled of rosemary. She washed her hands slowly, fingers first, then wrists, palms, and the space beneath each nail. She did it not just to keep sickness away, but to greet the new soul with care. Clean hands, clean cloth, clean breath. The room might have been dark, the straw floor uneven, the air thick with pain and prayers, but when the baby came, the first thing it felt was warmth. Not cold steel, not sharp wind, but a hand, a cloth, and water that had known waiting. Afterward, when the child cried and the mother wept, the midwife washed again. She sat by the fire, soaking her hands one more time, not because they were dirty, but because they had touched something sacred. And so, her hands rested in silence, cradled in warm water, as if to remind the world cleanliness was not just of the body, but of the heart that served it. The candle maker and the soot of solitude. In a narrow stone house behind the abbey, the candle maker lived alone. His days were long, and they smelled of beeswax and smoke. He stirred the melted wax in great vats, dipped wicks again and again, and lined his shelves with tiny towers of light waiting to be born. But candle making was a dirty craft. The soot clung to his fingers. His nails turned black with ash. His apron was stiff with wax. So, at the end of each day, he had a ritual. He would fetch a small pail of water from the stream just beyond the hill. Into it, he poured a few drops of vinegar, a handful of lavender, and a slice of lemon, if he had one. This was his wash. His private, quiet cleansing. He would sit at his workbench, roll up his sleeves, and lower his hands into the basin. And for a few long moments, he would do nothing but soak. Let the soot loosen. Let the warmth settle into his bones. Let the scent climb into the corners of the room. Then he would take a wooden brush, scrub gently, rinse, and repeat. Not out of vanity, no visitors ever came. Not out of piety, he rarely went to chapel. But because the wax he poured each day deserved clean hands. Because light, he believed, should be born from something pure. And though no one ever asked, the candles he made burned longer than most. And always, at their center, was the memory of water. The little girl who loved rain. In a small village where the roofs leaked and the pots turned to rivers in spring, lived a little girl who loved the rain. She loved it not for the puddles, though she splashed in those too. Not for the thunder, though she counted the seconds after each flash. She loved the rain because it was the only bath she could trust. Her family had little. A bucket here, a rat there. Once a week, if the hearth was burning strong, her mother would heat a pot and call her in. But most days, it was just cold cloth on cold skin. Except when it rained. Then she would run outside barefoot, arms stretched, face turned upward, letting the sky do the washing. Her hair would flatten against her cheeks. Her feet would turn to mud. Her eyes would close, and she would smile. She would pretend that the rain had names, that each drop whispered a secret as it slid down her nose. Kindness, one might say. Hope, said another. Peace. She would spin slowly, like a dancer. And when she was soaked through, chilled, joyful, glowing, she would run inside, wrap herself in a thick linen sheet, and curl up by the fire. Her mother never scolded. She only smiled and combed the girl's wet hair with her fingers. Rain never hurt a soul, she would say. And in that home of cracked beams and damp walls, a kind of cleanness lived. One not measured by soap, but by joy. The weaver's basin and the dust of looms. In the far corner of a quiet village, there lived a weaver whose loom never slept. Day after day, The rhythmic clatter of wooden beams echoed softly from her window, a lullaby made of thread and patience. Her fingers were always coated in dust, to soft flakes from wool, tiny clouds of flax, 1,000 invisible fibers. It clung to her knuckles, settled under her nails, painted her palms a pale gray. No matter how fine the fabric she made, she wore the cost of its making. But each night, when the sun began to dip behind the hayfields, she performed a simple ceremony. She filled a wide basin with warm water, drawn from the well behind her cottage. Sometimes she added crushed mint leaves. Sometimes dried rose petals. Sometimes nothing at all, just water, quiet and honest. She sat at her stool, slipped her hands beneath the surface, and let them rest there. Motionless, grateful. The water turned cloudy within seconds, but the weaver did not mind. She would whisper to herself stories as she soaked, of fabrics once made for a wedding, of cloth spun for a newborn's blanket, of a shawl woven in silence for a widow in winter. And as she washed, she remembered each one. Not for their beauty, but for the hands that touched them. When she dried her fingers, they were not smooth. The calluses remained, but they were clean. And clean hands, she believed, gave kinder dreams. So she lay down, every night, not in a grand bed, but beneath a quilt stitched by her own hands that had worked, and then forgiven themselves. The shepherd and the stream below the hill. He lived in the hills. Not in a house, but beneath the sky, with a cloak, a crook, and a dog by his side. His flock roamed freely, their bells ringing like wind chimes through the grass. He was alone, but never lonely. The sheep knew his voice. The wind carried his scent, and the earth remembered his steps. He rose with the mist, slept beneath stars, ate when the sheep were still. But there was one thing he did without fail. Every single morning, he bathed his hands and face in the stream that wound below his grazing hill. The water was cold, even in summer. It ran smooth over stones older than time. He would kneel at its edge, dip both hands into the current, and lift it to his face with reverence. The water rinsed away sleep, and dreams, and the long, silent conversations he had had with the sky during the night. Sometimes he would wash the dust from his feet, or run wet fingers through his tangled hair. Sometimes he said nothing, but the stream heard anyway. It became his mirror, his chapel, his quiet friend. He didn't own soap or perfumes, but he was cleaner than kings, because every drop that touched him had come from somewhere honest. And when he returned to his sheep, with wine-chapped cheeks and wet hands, he carried a kind of purity no crown could offer. The old woman and the rain barrel. In the last cottage before the forest began, lived a woman with a back bent by time, but eyes that still sparkled with mischief. She had once been a cook for a manor house, then a nanny, then a widow. Now she lived alone, with a cat named Butter and a rain barrel by her door. She had no servants, no hearth large enough to heat bath water, but she kept clean in her own quiet way. After every rainfall, she'd step outside, a slow but certain, and lift the wooden lid from her barrel. She'd dip in a tin ladle, fill a basin, and bring it inside. The water was always cold, sometimes sweet with leaves, sometimes clear as glass. She would set it on her table, roll up her sleeves, and begin her evening wash. Hands first, then face, then neck, then, on occasion, even her feet, if the cat wasn't curled in her lap. She used a cloth made from an old shirt. No scent, no soap. Just water, patience, and memory. She said the rain carried stories from the clouds, and that if you listened closely, you could hear bits of lullabies from other lands, echoing in the splash of a basin. When she finished, she would light a candle, wrap herself in a shawl that still smelled of thyme, and hum to herself as she brushed her silver hair. And though she lived alone, no one who passed her garden gate ever doubted. Here was a woman who remembered how to care for things, even the smallest rituals, even herself. The bathhouse keeper's secret piece. Tucked behind the town square, just past the baker's alley and the shoemaker's wall, stood an old public bathhouse. Its door was worn smooth by generations of hands. Its walls echoed not with laughter, but with the hush of steam and whispers. The keeper of this bathhouse was a quiet man with silver streaks in his beard. He had once been a soldier, then a farrier, but he found his peace here in the smell of hot water, wet stone, and herbs steeping in copper pots. Each morning before sunrise, before the first guest arrived, he would open the windows, stoke the fire under the water tank, and prepare the baths. He scattered mint leaves and dried sage into the corners, and let the steam bloom like breath rising from the earth. But before anyone stepped into the chamber, he always performed a private ritual. He would kneel by the smallest tub, a little one, used rarely, and pour water from a ladle over his own hands. Then his wrists. Then the back of his neck. Then, gently, his heart. No one ever saw this. No one ever asked. But he did it all the same. Because he believed that to serve cleanliness, one must enter clean. Later, he would scrub backs, carry towels, refill basins. He would listen to the quiet confessions of farmers, the soft weeping of widows, the tired sighs of merchants. The bathhouse was not just warm. It was forgiving. And that forgiveness began with a man and a ladle of water, who understood that hygiene was never just about the body, but about gentleness shared. The boy who polished the monk's shoes. In the stone corridors of an ancient monastery, where candles flickered low and silence hung like mist, lived a boy named Elias. He was not a monk, not yet. He was the boy who cleaned their shoes. Each night, as the brothers finished prayers and meals and settled into their chambers, Elias would walk quietly from room to room, collecting their sandals, boots, and slippers. Some were caked with mud. Others smelled of fields or firewood. All were signs of a life lived in quiet duty. Elias took them to the little room behind the kitchen, a place lit by a single oil lamp, always warm with the scent of wax and lye. There, he had his tools, a cloth, a brush, and a bowl of warm water with thyme floating on the surface. He would wash the shoes carefully, not to make them shine, but to make them ready. He believed that clean shoes meant clean paths. That even a monk, walking in silence to prayer, deserved to step on stone with care beneath him. He would dip his cloth, wring it just so, and press gently over each leather surface. He would whisper little prayers not for himself, but for the feet that would wear them. When he was done, he lined them up along the corridor wall, perfectly spaced. No one ever thanked him. No one had to. Because every brother who slipped into those soft, clean shoes in the dark morning hours felt something small and good beneath them, as if their journey began not in their thoughts, but in the hands of a boy who believed in walking well. The woman who washed her sorrows in milk. In a wooden house with shutters always half closed, there lived a woman with tired eyes and kind hands. She had lost much, a child in the fever, a husband in the war, a sister to silence. She didn't speak much, but the neighbors said she always smelled of warm bread and lavender. She kept to herself, mostly. Tended a small garden. Fed stray cats. And every week, on the evening of the quietest day, she would wash her face with milk. She didn't do this out of vanity. There were no mirrors in her house. She did it because it made her feel soft again. She would heat the milk just enough to be warm, not scalding. Then add crushed chamomile flowers, stir with a wooden spoon, and pour it into a clay bowl. She'd take a strip of linen, soak it gently, and press it against her face, closed eyes, cheeks, lips, neck. And as the warmth touched her skin, she would remember softness. The baby she once held. The kiss she once gave. The words she once whispered in the dark. The milk wasn't magic. It couldn't bring anyone back. But it reminded her that her skin still breathed, her body still lived, and she was still worth touching gently. When she finished, She would dry her face with a towel she had embroidered long ago, and place the bowl by the window, so the cats might drink what she did not use. And in that gesture, quiet, private, and loving, she found a kind of cleanness that no water could give. A healing that didn't fix, but forgave. The candle maker and the soap that sang. In the bend of a cobbled road near the abbey, there was a narrow shop with no sign. Only a soft scent floated from its window, wax oil, and something else, something like lavender caught in the rain. The woman who lived there made candles by day and soap by night. She rarely spoke, but her hands, always warm with oil and ash, told every story she needed to tell. Her soaps were not carved or fancy. They were rough blocks, square like bread loaves, colored pale green, ivory, or sometimes amber. But they sang when touched by water. Not a melody of notes, but a melody of memory. For each bar she made carried a scent tied to a timed chamomile for childhood, rosemary for mourning, honey for forgiveness. She washed with them only once a week, after sundown on Sundays. She would light a small candle, not one for sale, but one she made only for herself. Then fill a basin with warm water, and unwrap the soap she had saved for that night. She would lather slowly, not to scrub away, but to remember. Each motion a pause, each rinse a kindness. And when the soap began to melt in her palm, she would whisper to it, as if it carried a part of her into the drain, a sorrow, a joy, a secret. When she finished, she wrapped the soap in cloth again and placed it on the shelf. Not to dry, but to rest. Because even soap, she believed, needed to sleep after touching someone's heart. The gravedigger and the midnight rain. Far from the town square, beneath a sky full of unmarked stars, the gravedigger worked in silence. He didn't mind the dark. He didn't fear the stillness. He only feared forgetting to be kind. Each morning, he washed the dirt from his hands with cold water from the well. Each night, after lowering the last shovel, he stood at the edge of the newest grave and waited. For what? No one knew. He never said. But if the clouds were kind, the rain would come. He would take off his hat, bow his head, and let the rain wash over him, his face, his shoulders, his arms, his palms, still clutching the wooden handle of the spade. He never used soap, never owned a towel. But the rain knew how to cleanse. Not just dirt, but silence. Not just sweat, but sorrow. The rain whispered over the stones, soaked into the ground he had just turned, and ran down the back of his neck like a prayer. Some said he talked to the rain. Others said he simply listened. But all agreed, no one buried the dead with as much gentleness as he did. Because he never forgot. The hands that buried must also be washed in something sacred, even if it came only from the sky. The mill girl and the river's edge. She worked from before dawn to just after dusk, turning wheels, lifting sacks, sorting grain. The air in the mill was thick with dust, with flour, with the hum of tired bodies. But she had a secret. Just beyond the mill's shadow, through a small opening in the brush, ran a narrow stream, clear, cold, fast. The river's edge was her chapel. Each evening, after her shift ended and the millstones slowed to rest, she would walk there in silence, carrying only a scrap of linen and a small cake of salt soap wrapped in leaves. She would kneel on a flat rock and lace her sleeves and dip her arms in. The water shocked her skin at first, a sudden gasp, but then, slowly, it brought relief. It carried away the powder from her wrists, the ache from her elbows, the quiet weight of labor. She washed her arms, her face, the back of her neck. Then she would close her eyes and whisper to the water, "Take what does not belong to me." The stream never answered in words, but it always listened. It always carried something away. Afterward, she would shake out her linen, rewrap her soap, and walk back through the grass, her arms still damp, her mind lighter. No one ever saw her. No one ever asked why her skin smelled of salt and wind. But those who worked beside her often said, "She smiles like someone who has just touched the sky, And perhaps she had. The knight who bathed before battle. Before the sun had risen, before the banners were raised or the war horns sounded, one knight stood barefoot in the dew-soaked grass, beside a basin of still water. His armor lay in pieces on the stones. Pauldrons, greaves, gauntlets, breastplate waiting. The sword remained in its scabbard. The shield leaned quietly against a tree. The knight knelt. He was not praying. He was washing. He dipped a cloth into the cold water and wiped his face. Then his hands. Then the inside of his wrists. He did not rush. He did not tremble. He had done this before every battle, for years. Others polished steel. He cleansed skin. Because he believed that if his body was clean, his mind would be still. And if his mind was still, his hand would not shake. He whispered to the water. Not for victory, but for clarity. Not for glory, but for return. Then he stood, piece by piece dressed himself in iron, and when he looked at his reflection in the basin, his eyes were calm. The others thought him superstitious. Perhaps he was. But he always came back. And when he did, he always returned to the water again. To wash off not just dirt, but memory. The queen and the linen of forgiveness. In the highest room of the keep, where windows were small and the air held the hush of perfume and parchment, a queen sat at a washstand of carved oak. She was not old, nor young, but her face carried the lines of worry etched gently with years of rule. Each night, after the chambermaids had gone, she would unpen her hair, remove her crown, and sit alone. She had a drawer of linens a dozens, neatly folded, each one used only once. She would choose one, dip it in rose water warmed beside the fire, and press it to her face. Not just to cleanse, but to release. Each cloth held the weight of the day. A difficult decision. A letter from the east. A lie told kindly. A truth spoken too late. She never used a linen. When the night was over, she placed it in a wooden box and closed the lid gently. Some believed she was vain. She was not. She knew that ruling left residue, and that to lead others, she had to first forgive herself. And so, each night, she offered forgiveness to her own reflection, through water, through cloth, through quiet. The castle slept, and so did she, a skin soft, heart lighter, cleansed not only by water, but by grace. The shepherd's last bath. High in the hills, where the winds whispered through the grass and the stars came early, an old shepherd lived in a stone hut with no door. His flock had grown small. His beard had grown long, and his bones creaked with every morning. But he was content. He had lived many winters, seen wolves and comets, plagues and springs. And now, he felt his time was near. So, one morning, he carried his old copper basin out to the stream. The same basin he'd used for 50 years. It was dented. The handle had broken, but it still held water. He filled it, carried it carefully back, set it beside his hut. He stripped to his skin. The sun was low and gold, the wind kind, and slowly, reverently, he bathed. He washed his feet, dusty from the paths. His arms, strong though thin. His chest, where time had carved its lines. He hummed as he did so, a melody no one had heard in years. Then he dried with a woolen cloth, sat on a stone, and watched the sheep wander. That night, he slept without pain, without dreams. Only the sound of wind, and the memory of water. And when the morning came, and the villagers found him still, they said he looked clean, not just in body, but in peace. They buried him in linen, the same kind he once used to dry the water from his face. And the basin was left at the stream, where it caught the rain, and waited for someone else who understood that the cleanest soul is one who remembers to wash before goodbye.